Candyman, Candyman, Candyman. It's fine, there's no mirror. Candyman, Candyman. Wait, what about the camera lens? Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2021 supernatural horror sequel, Candyman. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Candyman stars Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, Teyonah Parris, and Colman Domingo, and was directed by DaCosta. Set nearly 30 years after the original film, it tells the story of Chicago-based artist Anthony McCoy, played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, who hears about the legend of Candyman and Helen Lyle, and soon finds that his obsession with the story extends beyond just his art. I really enjoy the first Candyman movie, and seem to like it even more every time I rewatch it. It's been nearly 30 years since it was released, but that film still holds up in almost every regard, and remains extremely relevant. It's got such a spectacular blend of genres and themes that create a spooky yet hauntingly satisfying story. That original film spawned 2 sequels during the 90s, but now, 29 years later, we've got another one. Despite its identical name, 2021's Candyman isn't a remake, but rather a direct sequel to the original 1992 film. So, I'll be honest, I only first watched the original Candyman back in 2020, but even without any long-standing nostalgia for the film, I was really curious and excited to see what they would do here with an extension of that story. One of the first things that stands out about the sequel when you're watching it is the visuals, and I gotta say, that's one of the strongest aspects of this film, and is something that's carried through the entirety of the runtime. Although it's largely lacking the poetically beautiful griminess that the Cabrini Green Towers imparted to the original film, this movie mostly makes up for it with its cinematography. The haunting, upside-down cityscapes of the title sequence are as mesmerizing as they are chilling, and that utilization of unusual camera angles and movement is returned to again and again throughout this film. It creates this sense of disorientation and paranoia, the overhead shots of Anthony during his manic painting scenes, the mind-boggling, spiraling perspective as the camera moves down hallways, even the way mirrors are filmed. Everything about the visuals here has a crispness to it, and a sense of designed intentionality. It's beautiful to look at, but I can't help but feel like it's missing that real, lived-in feel that the first film captured so well. To be fair, that was partly out of the filmmaker's hands. As the sequel explains, Cabrini Green doesn't really exist anymore, at least not in a physical sense. The high-rises that were featured so prominently in the 1992 film were demolished a decade ago. Among the only physical remnants of the infamous housing projects are the largely abandoned row houses, which do briefly feature in this film. But even those few scenes don't provide that same sensation that the real locations did in the original. Admittedly, this does speak to the film's comments on gentrification, but it doesn't hit quite the same way, and ironically, almost makes this sequel feel like a visual embodiment of the gentrification it's criticizing. Speaking of the themes, this film is full of them. Granted, the original movie was a thematically dense and diverse affair too, but the way the sequel presents its themes feels very different, and not necessarily in a good way. As I mentioned before, the 1992 film is still extraordinarily relevant today, and this film, very reasonably, seeks to highlight that. Racial tensions, police indifference, police brutality, community isolation, and the inception and perpetuation of urban legends are all themes that are prominently featured once again. In addition to those recurring themes, this sequel also touches on some additional ones: gentrification, over-policing, critical ignorance and broad dismissal, erasure, even the role of art in telling cultural and community-based stories. All of these themes and ideas are really important, and certainly relevant to the story, but unfortunately, they're not all well conveyed. That's not to say audiences aren't going to understand or pick up on the themes. Most of them are very blunt and prominently repeated, but they also feel non-specific and broadly painted. Perhaps it's a consequence of the film trying to touch on too many things at once, but it does a bunch of telling without much showing to reinforce its ideas. This also causes an issue with the film's focus. With the theme so prominently front and center, the story and plot get buried a bit. Rather than the themes reinforcing and adding layered depth to the story, as was the case in the first film, this script feels like it was written in reverse. That the themes and messages were decided on first, and then the plot was kind of pieced together to fill in the gaps. As a result, this movie feels a bit muddled. It's a direct sequel to the 1992 film, but at times it almost feels like a reboot. There are plenty of callbacks and references to police fans of the original, but some of the connections feel almost like a hindrance, considering how minimally they're explained or expanded on as part of the story. In particular, there's a big revelatory moment that's exceptionally cool, but doesn't really make all that much sense when you think about the context of the first film. And that would have been fine if they'd expanded on the idea here in order to explain why something is occurring, but they don't, and kind of just run with this superficial connection. So it's nice to see the links between these two films, but it seems like there were better options for more strongly connecting the stories. The first 2 acts of this film are fairly solid. There is a little too much telling and not enough showing, especially when it comes to some of the prominent themes, but at times it's very reminiscent of the mysterious setup and build-up during the opening half of the original film. Once again, we see a character investigating this legend and the history of Cabrini Green, and the film certainly draws some obvious parallels between Anthony and Helen Lyle. Everything from photographing graffiti, to interviewing residents, to their growing obsession with the story. But then the third act hits, and I gotta say, there's a strange disconnect within this film. Because the first 2 acts are building to something that's never actually delivered. The third act is a sudden escalation out of nowhere that gets wild. It's not bad, and in fact makes a good finale to a horror film. We just weren't given the beginning and middle to that particular film here. Admittedly, the 1992 Candyman also has a good deal of dissonance between its first and second half, but somehow it came together by the end in a much more natural and cohesive way. Candyman is a decent but unexpectedly frustrating sequel for me. There's plenty of good here. The cinematography and visuals, the thematic content, the central performances were all really strong. The use of mirrors and reflection was wonderful, right from the very beginning with the mirrored studio intros. Even the body horror and makeup effects, gruesome and deeply unsettling. But somehow, all the good pieces don't come together to make a great movie. The story's muddled and at times feels like an afterthought. The script and much of the dialogue is surprisingly underwhelming. Even the score isn't particularly memorable, though luckily we do get a bit of Philip Glass's original theme during the credits. This film feels like a bizarre, distorted facsimile of the original. A reflection, refracted through time, that loses its nuance and compelling story while retaining fragments of the premise and thematic importance. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is the cinematography. There's no doubt that this is a wonderfully shot film. The haunting beauty of the opening cityscape title sequence is perhaps never bested, but I was struck by the crisp quality of the visual aesthetics throughout. The camera movements are very effectively disorienting at the right points. The unusual perspectives and angles appropriately reflect the tone. Speaking of reflections, the use of mirrors and other reflective surfaces is really creatively and ominously done. Even the silhouetted shadow puppetry during the storytelling scenes was beautifully shot. On the con side, the biggest issue has to do with the film's focus. I think this is something that mostly stems from the script and is perhaps the result of having 3 different writers contributing, but this movie feels like it's more concerned with its themes than it is with its story. Themes are important, especially in horror movies, and I think the themes touched on in this film are all very worthwhile and relevant, but they're almost too prominent. Rather than enhancing and providing depth to the story, they largely overshadow it. So the themes and messages become the major focus, rather than the plot or characters. Those latter aspects end up feeling like an afterthought at times, and although I don't think this was actually the case, it almost feels like this script began life as something else, and was turned into a Candyman sequel partway through writing. The second con has similar origins as the first, and is the third act shift. Now, I don't think the third act is bad. It's certainly among the most exciting parts of the film, really delivering the horror elements. Not necessarily thrilling chills, but the body horror gets pretty intense here, and the film finally delivers on some of its thematic concepts visually, rather than just purely via dialogue. But this third act comes out of nowhere. We get all of this setup during the first 2/3 of the film, but then all of a sudden things escalate to this wild, what is happening third act. It's so rushed and feels like we're missing 15 or 20 minutes of the movie that would have connected the second and third acts. It's a good horror movie finale, but not the ending that the rest of the film was building up to. Again, I think this comes back to the script and the sidelining of the plot in favor of the themes. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Candyman or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission for anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Candyman 3 out of 5 paws. It's a great looking film that creatively ties to the original movie and updates its themes to include even more important concepts, but does so at the cost of creating an engaging narrative or particularly compelling characters. I would recommend Candyman to anybody interested in a modern social horror film. This film wears its themes perhaps a little too prominently on its sleeve, but it's still decently thrilling and certainly has some important things to say. Existing fans of Candyman will likely enjoy the references and callbacks scattered throughout this film, but people who've never seen the original movie should have no problem understanding this one, because they recount most of the important events of the first movie several times here. If you liked Candyman, I definitely recommend the original 1992 Candyman. Not only is it the predecessor to this film, setting up for many of the events and characters featured here, but it's also just a remarkably good movie that's quite a bit more than its slasher designation would imply. If you're interested in another good modern social thriller, you should really check out Us. It too does some really cool and interesting things with the idea of mirroring, and also happened to be written by Jordan Peele, who was one of the co-writers of this film. If you're interested in a slight genre shift and want to take a look at a film that was definitely an influence here, you've got to watch The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. It's an Italian giallo film, a genre that significantly factored into the first Candyman movie, and also features a very important and violent scene in an art gallery. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Candyman? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite sequel set decades after the original movie? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe if you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.